Okay, nice to meet you all. My name is Anja, and I come from both industry, kind of. So whenever I come to space lawyers, because I was competing in space competitions, and I talk about blockchains, everybody's looking at me like, where do you live, on Mars or on Moon? And when I come to the blockchain community and I start talking about space law, everybody looks at me strange, so that really exists. But nice to have you all here. I'm not crazy, or I'm not the only one. So space law actually exists, and these are the topics that I wanted to address, at least like basically address. So the first should be the introduction to space law, which treaties exist on the international level. Then who owns the moon, because that's pretty much the frequently asked question. The basic principles of the international laws and the definition of the promise of all mankind. Then there are some case law analogies, the main question, liabilities and responsibilities, and the open questions which could be addressed by the blockchain community. So the space law actually looks like this. The first one was the Outer Space Treaty. All those treaties are actually older than I am. So that's amazing. I mean, it surprised me when I started studying the space law. But so the Outer Space Treaty is the basic one. It has all the principles that are relevant when we are going to space. The Rescue Agreement addresses the issues with the astronauts, which are basically the envoy of all mankind. Space Liability Convention is a peculiarity when it comes to international law because it introduces the fault liability. That's like nowhere to find in international law, but in space law. Registration Convention is pretty much the basic for everybody that want to launch any space objects. And the Moon Treaty, which is, well, we can just forget about that because nobody wants to sign it. Or those who signed it want to withdraw from it, so it's basically irrelevant. But still introduces quite a lot of new principles or new ideas to space, so there are still some things that we should know from the Moon Agreement. So who owns the moon? Anybody? No? No? Okay. Depends. That's kind of the answer that all the lawyers provide, usually. So to get the answer, who owns the moon, we actually have to go through all the principles that are introduced by the Outer Space Treaty. And first of the principles that is really, really strong is that all the nation states, need to cooperate. So the international cooperation is really necessary in order for us to come into space and to distribute all the resources that we have there. So what the outer space introduced is the irrespective of their degree of economic or scientific development, because they kind of knew that not all the states that existed at that time are going to be space-faring nations. So not everybody is capable to go into space. A lot of nations, like mine, is probably never going to make it because we're too small. I come from Slovenia. We just entered into the agreement with the European Space Agency. And also that the exploration and the use of space should be perceived as the province of all mankind. What that means, nobody knows. First question, open question. The second basic principle is that there should be freedom of exploration and use. So what has to be known is that scientific exploration and the use of space are free to everybody. The use actually addresses the commercial use as well. So not only the use that benefits or is into the interest of all nation states, so for example the public interest, but also the commercial interest. So we can actually go into space and sell whatever we find in space. Again, all states without discrimination and on a basis of equality. And there should be freedom of access. That means that once you land, for example, on the moon, you should still give the access to everybody that comes to the moon and provide that they use your space objects or your space station. So everybody should have the access. You shouldn't just come there and occupy. Although, when it comes to the freedom of access, there are a couple of limitations. So, for example, the Article 9 of the Outer Space Treaty introduces those limitations quite hard. Because, for example, when you go to space and there's another nation already in the space, you have to take all these interests or all these activities that the other nation is providing or doing in the space into account. So you can't just go there and drill the moon if somebody else is already present there with their rovers. Everybody have to have the free access. So, who owns the moon again? All mankind. It's our common thing. It's perceived to be as the province of all mankind. Now, the Outer Space Treaty presents another principle, and that's one of the strongest one. It's the Non-Appropriation Principle, and it says that anything in the outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies, should not be subject to any national appropriation by claim of sovereignty, means of use, occupation, or any other means. What that actually means was debated several times, and it's still an open question among the lawyers, of course. So, for example, when you go to the UN and they pose a question, so what happens if somebody goes to an asteroid and starts drilling the asteroid and gets all the minerals from it? So it actually occupies the asteroid by just extracting and just taking the minerals, and nobody knows. Because you kind of can own the minerals, but you cannot own the asteroid. So this is like a contradiction in itself. Okay, these might be the case laws. So there were a couple of claims of sovereignty, there were a couple of claims of private placing, and there were private sales of plots on the moon. So for example, I don't know how many of you are familiar with it, but there's the Lunar Embassy from China that gave or sold the certificates, and there's a lot of people that bought the moon. I mean, I even know a lot of people that bought a star and name it, but you know, that's not possible. You can't just buy a couple of properties on the moon and claim it to be yours. Also, there was a guy named Nimitz, and he had a company, Shoemaker, and he claimed that he owns an asteroid. So when NASA brought a satellite to that asteroid, he actually gave to NASA a receipt for the parking. So that's insane. That went to the US court, I mean, only in America, but he failed. I mean, that's, you know, it's not possible to charge NASA for the parking. Also, claims of sovereignty, somebody could say that you can just park on the moon, put a flag on it, and claim that you occupied it. That's not happening. It's part of the non-appropriation principle, and it's one of the strongest principles. It actually is perceived to be a customary law. So what that means in international law is, for example, the Outer Space Treaty was signed and ratified by a lot of states in the world. And if a state, if a state decides that it's going to withdraw from this treaty, that doesn't mean anything. Because all these principles are perceived to be the customary law according to international law. That means that they are binding to all the nations and all the non-governmental and governmental entities, even though the state withdrew. What about natural resources? That's a tough question, and it's complicated. So, the Outer Space Treaty does not really present any regime when it comes to the resources. It does allow use of the Outer Space Treaty, the celestial bodies and the moon, but the Moon Agreement actually introduced that a regime can be taken into account, and that you can actually take the resources out of the surface and own them. Now, here's where I actually see the possible interactions with the blockchain community and the space community. As the guys from Moonshot Express said, I don't see you, but they were talking about the marketing and how there was the platform with pixels and how somebody sold all those pixels to a lot of agencies, a lot of companies. And when it comes to space, If we perceive it as the common heritage, if we perceive the whole surface of the moon as not being able to appropriate it, we can just make a grid out of it. And then we can appropriate that grid. So that might be a solution where blockchain can come into the game. Then here's the thing. The Moon Agreement, even though it wasn't ratified by a lot of states, introduces the common heritage of mankind. That's not the same as the province of all mankind. When it comes to common heritage of mankind, that's where we create analogies with the law of the sea and the law of Antarctic. But basically, space is not same as the law of the sea. Because, for example, when you have open sea, if there is an island emerging out of the sea, everybody can just go there and occupy that island. When you go to space, there is no possible way that something emerges and you can just occupy it. So that's the main difference. Also, the common heritage of mankind is, it's an idea that basically presents that there should be a regime. So before we come up with the idea of having a regime, how we're going to distribute all the resources that we actually mine, there is a moratorium, meaning nobody is capable of doing this exploitation. So since nobody wants to sign the Moon Agreement, there is a question whether this moratorium for the Moon and Mars and all the other celestial bodies exists or not. And it's a question that is highly debated in the UN. And there's a lot of people that are going into the direction that there is no moratorium. For example, the US and the Luxembourg already introduced their own national laws, which are claiming that you can just go there, and if you're a US citizen, you're going to own those minerals. What that means for us is that they're actually mining our minerals. But, I mean, is that into my benefit? I don't know. Are they going to sell it for a fair price? I have no idea. Are they going to sell it twice? If they're going to use the blockchain, maybe not, but let's think about it. Okay, so moratorium, and there is the DAO. That's probably known to those who are in the blockchain industry, so that's distributed autonomous organizations. And I don't know if Space Decentralized is present here, but they were actually having an article about that. And it's basically matching multiple governance models. So you can have a lot of different models for a lot of companies, just creating these decentralized autonomous organizations. And the main questions that need to be addressed is how the management is going to look like over time, how we are going to see what are the contributions, and have an insight on how there's going to be the distribution of whatever these contributions are going to present. And then there are, for example, separations of powers that are always present when we are talking about the governance. And that is how we are going to talk about the decision-making process, which is basically just how are we going to come up with the laws and the solutions, and the dispute resolutions. Now, what all the space law actually present, and that could be deliberated in the blockchain industry as well, is to come up with the code of conducts. If anybody wrote or read the GDPR, that's basically the same. We can all come with special agreements or just codes that we agree upon, unanimously if possible, and then present these to the UN or to anybody that wants to go to space. And if they agree, then this is going to make a customary decision or a customary rule, which is going to be applied if there's going to be a judgment on the international court. Okay, responsibility. So the Outer Space Treaty presents quite a lot of responsibilities and presents quite a lot of liabilities. The main difference between those two is that you are responsible for actions and liable for the damages. When it comes to responsibilities, we all have to know that if you are sending something into space, you have to take care of who's going to authorize it, who's going to take care of the continuous supervision, and it covers the actions of governmental agencies as well as non-governmental entities. That means that no matter who launches, even if there's going to be an unauthorized launch, there's going to be a state that's going to be responsible for those actions. And it goes the same for liability. The only difference with all the other international laws is that there is fault-based liability, which means that you have absolute liabilities for any damage that happens on Earth by a space object that is sent to a space, or you have fault liability if this damage is done, for example, on Mars or the Moon. There are different conditions, and the first relevant is, for example, that is being deliberated as well, that damage is done by a space object to a space object. Now, if you have 3D printed objects, that might not be an object because there is a peculiar definition of a space object in liability convention. And it demands that a space object is launched into space. Now, if an object is not launched into space, but is created in space by or from moon resources, that's basically not a space object. And nobody's going to be liable for a space object or the damage done by that space object. So that's like another open question when it comes to space law. And these are all the open questions that could, just connect the blockchain community with the space communities. So what happens when a non-state party launches a space object from a territory which is under no jurisdiction whatsoever? That is basically Moon, basically Mars, or the open sea, or, for example, if an entity which is not recognized by the international community occupies a new island. There's a lot of scenarios. What happens when damage are not caused by an object? So we talked about the 3D objects. That also goes the same for the cyber attacks and the signals, because those are pretty much not objects. How do we codify and automate our space activities so they comply with most of the basic, customary, and compulsory provisions? That's kind of it.